What's the wildest Antarctica conspiracy theory you've heard? Story 1: the 1938-39 German Antarctic expedition is not a conspiracy theory. It happened, it's thoroughly documented, and it's genuinely strange enough that it doesn't require embellishment. In late 1938, the German ship Schwabenland departed Hamburg carrying a team of scientists, pilots, and military personnel with the stated mission of surveying Antarctic territory for potential whale oil operations. Germany at the time was the world's largest consumer of whale oil, used in food production and as a component in explosives manufacturing, and Norwegian dominance of Antarctic whaling was a genuine commercial and strategic concern for the German government. The expedition surveyed approximately 600,000 square kilometers of Antarctic territory, which German aircraft systematically overflew and photographed while dropping thousands of small aluminum dart-shaped devices stamped with the German inscription to mark claimed territory. The region was designated Neuschwabenland, New Swabia, on German maps. The crew returned in early 1939 with extensive photographic survey data and geographic information that was immediately classified by the German government. The conspiracy theory layer added to this real history is that the whale oil justification was cover for something else. Scouting locations for a secret wartime installation, a submarine refueling station, or, in the more elaborate versions, the site of a future hidden German base where defeated Reich leadership would eventually relocate. The real expedition provides enough documented genuine strangeness. The dramatic territorial claiming by aircraft dropped flags, the immediate classification, the wartime context, that conspiracy elaborations have been attaching themselves to it ever since, without needing to invent a starting point. Story 2: on July 10, 1945, approximately 2 months after Germany's formal surrender on May 8, the German submarine U-530 surfaced off the coast of Mar del Plata, Argentina, and surrendered to Argentine authorities. The crew, under a captain who was considerably younger than would typically command such a vessel, offered an explanation of their movements that Argentine and Allied investigators found incomplete and unconvincing. A second submarine, U-977, followed in August 1945, surrendering after an even longer voyage. Both submarines had crossed the Atlantic after Germany's surrender, rather than surrendering in European waters, and neither crew provided a fully satisfying account of why. U-530's commander claimed they had been at sea continuously since before the surrender, unaware of the war's end, a claim that Allied investigators considered implausible given the timeline and the submarine's fuel and provision status upon arrival. The specific conspiracy theory that has attached to these surrenders is that the submarines had made one or more stops in Antarctic waters, according to the most specific versions, dropping off high-ranking German officials, SS leadership, or in the most dramatic variant, Adolf Hitler himself, before proceeding to Argentina to surrender. The theory is sustained by the timing anomaly, the incomplete official explanations, and the documented reality that numerous German officials did escape to South America in the post-war period through various rat line networks, some with Argentine government assistance. Neither Allied investigation nor any subsequent documentary discovery has confirmed an Antarctic stop by either submarine. The Argentine surrender remains a genuine historical anomaly that never received a fully satisfying public explanation. Story 3: Operation High Jump was the largest Antarctic expedition ever mounted. 4,700 naval personnel, 13 ships including the aircraft carrier US Philippine Sea, 23 aircraft, and equipment and supplies for an extended polar operation, departing in August 1946 under the command of Admiral Richard Byrd. The official stated purposes were to train personnel in polar operations, test military equipment under extreme cold weather conditions, consolidate American Antarctic territorial claims, and conduct aerial survey and mapping. The expedition was planned to last the full austral summer season, approximately 6 months. It ended after approximately 8 weeks. The official explanation for the early departure cited deteriorating weather conditions and the end of the Antarctic summer making further operations impractical. This explanation has satisfied neither historians who study the expedition in detail, nor the conspiracy theory community that has made High Jump one of its central Antarctic texts. Theories about what actually caused the early return range from the barely plausible to the extraordinary, a military engagement with surviving German forces in Antarctic territory, encounters with unknown aircraft that damaged U.S. equipment, the discovery of something beneath the ice that was deemed too sensitive to continue exposing personnel to, or a command decision that the Antarctic threat assessment the mission was designed to generate had been completed. Admiral Byrd's own statements after the operation, speaking in a Chilean newspaper interview about the threat posed by aircraft capable of flying pole to pole at incredible speeds, have been interpreted by theorists as veiled references to technology encountered during the mission. What happened during those 8 weeks that caused 5,000 personnel and a carrier group to leave early remains officially attributed to weather. That explanation has never fully closed the question. Story 4, the quote attributed to German Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, something to the effect of having built an invulnerable fortress or paradise in the land of eternal ice, is one of the most persistently repeated elements in Antarctic German base conspiracy theory, and one of the most difficult to verify from the primary source. Nitz was the commander-in-chief of the German Navy, the architect of the U-boat campaign that came closer to severing Allied Atlantic supply lines than almost any other Axis strategy, and the man Adolf Hitler named as his successor in his final testament. He was tried at Nuremberg, convicted of war crimes related to his submarine warfare conduct, and sentenced to 10 years imprisonment. He died in 1980. The specific quote attributed to him at Nuremberg about an invulnerable fortress in eternal ice does not appear in the standard published records of the Nuremberg proceedings in the form conspiracy theorists cite it. Researchers who have investigated the quote's provenance have been unable to locate it in verified Nuremberg documentation, and the most likely explanation for its persistence is that it was either fabricated, significantly paraphrased beyond recognition, or taken from a different context and date. What is documented is that Nitz commanded the German Navy during the period when U-boats were operating in the South Atlantic, that German submarines did have the range to reach Antarctic waters in principle, and that Nitz was not forthcoming about all aspects of German naval operations during his post-war interrogations and testimony. The specific Eternal Ice Fortress quote is probably not as authentic as commonly cited. The broader questions about what the German submarine fleet's full activities in the South Atlantic were during the war's final period are somewhat less definitively closed. Story 5, Operation Tabarin, was a British secret Antarctic operation that began in 1943 and continued after the war's end, establishing the first year-round British Antarctic bases at Deception Island and Port Lockroy on the Antarctic Peninsula. Its wartime justification was genuine and documented. German surface raiders and submarines operating in the South Atlantic had used remote coves and anchorages for resupply and shelter, and the British government was concerned that Antarctic bays could provide similar support for Axis naval operations, particularly given the documented German interest in the region shown by the 1938-39 expedition. Operation Tabarin was classified as a military operation. Its personnel were naval personnel in civilian clothing, and its existence was not publicly acknowledged during the war. What the conspiracy theory layer adds to this documented reality is the suggestion that Tabarin's stated purpose, denying German raiders safe harbor, was either secondary to or cover for monitoring German activity in the Antarctic that the British had specific reasons to believe was occurring. If the German expedition had located a usable installation site, and if German submarines were later using it, Britain would have had strong incentive to surveil Antarctic waters without disclosing why. Operation Tabarin's wartime activities remain partially classified even now, which is unusual for operations of this period, and has contributed to sustained interest in what it was actually monitoring during its more sensitive activities. The post-war continuation of the operation, which eventually became the British Antarctic Survey, is entirely scientific and well documented. The wartime years are the period of genuine remaining ambiguity. Story 6 in 1996, a text began circulating in conspiracy and alternative history communities that purported to be the secret diary of Admiral Richard Byrd, describing a February 1947 flight in which his aircraft was taken over by a mysterious force that guided it into a vast opening at the South Pole, into a temperate, lush interior world inhabited by a technologically advanced civilization of tall, blonde, Nordic-looking beings. In this diary, Byrd is brought before a representative of this civilization called a master, who tells him that the inner Earth beings have observed humanity's nuclear weapons development with alarm, and that Byrd has been brought there specifically to receive a message for American government leadership, that this destructive path cannot be permitted to continue, and that the inner Earth civilization will intervene if necessary. Byrd returns to his aircraft, is guided back to the surface, and subsequently presents his account to the Pentagon and President Truman, who order him to classify the entire encounter and remain silent. The text is not as authentic as Byrd's diary. Byrd's genuine journals and records from his Antarctic expeditions are held in the Byrd Polar Research Center at Ohio State University, extensively studied by historians, and contain no account of any such encounter. The flight described in the purported diary doesn't match any documented flight from Byrd's expeditions, and the narrative's specific themes, Nordic beings, hollow Earth, nuclear war warnings, are consistent with mid-20th century esoteric and science fiction literature rather than with military aviation records. The text is fiction, almost certainly written decades after Byrd's death. What's interesting is how effectively it attached itself to a genuinely mysterious historical figure and real expedition, giving the fictional frame a documentary texture it doesn't deserve. Story 7, the idea of a civilization living inside the Earth, is not an invention of the internet age or even of 20th century conspiracy culture. It appears in mythology and religious tradition across cultures so separated geographically and historically that the convergence is genuinely interesting as a piece of comparative mythology, even for people who don't take the literal content seriously. In Tibetan Buddhist tradition, Shambhala is a hidden kingdom of advanced beings located somewhere in Inner Asia, often described as within a valley surrounded by impossible mountains, or, in some traditions, within the earth itself. In Hindu cosmology, the subterranean realm of Patala is described as a rich, beautiful underworld inhabited by supernatural beings. Norse mythology includes Svartalfheim, the underground realm of the Dark Elves. Various Native American traditions describe peoples who lived underground before emerging to the surface world. The specific name Agartha was applied to the hollow earth concept by the 19th century French occultist Alexandre Saint-Yves d'Alvedre, who claimed to have learned of it through a process he called synarchic communication. The name subsequently became the standard term in esoteric tradition for the inner earth civilization, and the Antarctic entrance location was added later by 20th century theorists building on Byrd expedition mythology. The cross-cultural resonance of underground world mythology is real and worth taking seriously as folklore. What drives it? Whether it reflects literal ancient memory of subterranean peoples, symbolic cosmological thinking, or something about human psychology that produces underground world mythologies independently across cultures, is a genuinely interesting question that has attracted serious mythological scholarship, all of which stops well short of endorsing a literal physical civilization beneath Antarctica. Story 8, Antarctica's land ownership situation is unique in the world. The Antarctic Treaty of 1959, which has been signed by all nations with territorial claims in the region, neither confirms nor rejects those existing territorial claims, and explicitly prohibits new sovereignty claims or the assertion of sovereignty by any party while the treaty remains in force. Private land ownership in Antarctica, land held by individuals rather than states, is essentially without legal framework since there is no Antarctic government to issue title, no court system to enforce ownership claims, and no treaty mechanism for private property. Against this backdrop, claims that specific wealthy families, including the Rothschilds and Rockefellers, hold private land interests in Antarctica circulate in conspiracy communities and produce a specific kind of puzzle. If Antarctica has no private land ownership system, what would it mean to own land there? And what might those interests actually represent? The reality is more mundane than the conspiracy framing implies. Various wealthy individuals and families have funded Antarctic research expeditions, endowed research programs at Antarctic institutes, or provided private funding for activities that have institutional connections to Antarctic science. Funding scientific work in a region doesn't constitute land ownership in any meaningful sense. The Rockefeller Plateau and various other Antarctic geographic features bear the names of wealthy Americans who funded early expeditions, naming rights, essentially, in exchange for expedition funding. Whether these funding relationships have produced any kind of privileged access, influence over research conducted in Antarctic facilities, or knowledge about what those facilities have found are different questions than the own land framing suggests. And they're less amenable to clean debunking because influence and access are harder to document than property titles. Story 9, the Piri Reis map, completed in 1513 by Ottoman cartographer Piri Reis, is a genuine and historically significant cartographic document held in the Topkapi Palace Museum in Istanbul. It depicts portions of the Atlantic coastline of Europe and Africa, as well as the Caribbean and parts of the South American coast. Information gathered from Portuguese and Spanish exploration charts of the preceding decades. The Antarctic controversy involves the southern portion of the map, which shows a landmass at the bottom that some researchers, beginning in the 1960s with retired U.S. Air Force Captain Charles Hapgood, argued represents the coastline of Antarctica as it would appear without ice, the subglacial topography, rather than the ice surface. The claim is that whoever produced the source maps from which Piri Reis worked had access to surveys of an ice-free Antarctica, requiring either a pre-glacial Antarctic civilization capable of maritime cartography or contact with such a civilization. Professional historians, geographers, and cartographic scholars who have examined this claim in detail have found it unconvincing. The southern landmass on the Piri Reis map is more plausibly interpreted as a speculative extension of the South American coast, or as Terra Australis Incognita, the hypothetical southern continent that cartographers of the period commonly included to balance the known northern landmasses. The specific coastline features that Hapgood matched to subglacial Antarctic topography required selective comparison and significant interpretive latitude. Antarctica was last ice-free approximately 35 million years ago. The specifics of the claim that a 1513 map shows its coastline accurately require either a civilization of that unimaginable antiquity with advanced cartography or a series of comparisons that don't survive careful examination. Story 10, the Bunger Hills, is a real geographic feature in East Antarctica, an area of approximately 850 square kilometers that is relatively free of ice and snow due to the specific local combination of wind patterns, topography, and thermal dynamics that creates an Antarctic oasis, a region where bare rock, meltwater lakes, and limited biological life are present in a continent otherwise almost uniformly covered in ice. In January 1947, during Operation High Jump, Byrd and crew became among the first to observe and photograph the Bunger Hills from the air, and the relatively green and unfrozen appearance of the area in an otherwise icy landscape was genuinely striking. Byrd described it as an oasis and a pleasant land in radio dispatches from the flight, language that, stripped of its geographic context, could be made to sound considerably more significant than a dry valley with meltwater lakes. The conspiracy layer attached to the Bunger Hills discovery involves claims that Byrd actually landed in this oasis and encountered some form of hidden life, an isolated human community, remnants of a lost civilization, or some other presence that would explain both the expedition's interest in the region and its early and unexplained termination. Some accounts fold this into the bird hollow earth mythology, presenting the oasis as an entrance. What actually happened at the Bunger Hills during high jump is documented. Aerial observation and photography. The pleasant land description was Byard's characterization of the visual impression of the bare rock and blue lakes compared to the ice that surrounded it on all sides. The subsequent scientific expeditions that have studied the Bunger Hills have found exactly what geology predicts: an ice-free area shaped by wind and local thermal dynamics, with no exits to inner Earth civilizations. Story 11, the Antarctic Pyramid Mountains. What went viral as ancient ruins is just what mountains look like in 2016. Satellite images showing sharply triangular, pyramid-like peaks in the heritage range of Antarctica spread across social media, with captions claiming they were evidence of an ancient human civilization that had built pyramids on the continent before it was covered in ice. The images were real. The pyramidal shapes were real. The pyramids were not. The specific features generating excitement were nunataks, a word derived from Greenlandic Inuit, meaning lonely mountain peak, rocky summits that protrude through an ice sheet. Nunataks are common in glaciated regions worldwide and take their characteristic shapes through a process called freeze-thaw weathering, combined with the erosive action of ice on all sides of an exposed peak. The mathematical properties of this process tend to produce triangular, sometimes almost perfectly pyramidal shapes, because ice carves from all sides equally, leaving the angular ridgelines that distinguish a horn peak. The Matterhorn in Switzerland is probably the most famous example of this shape, produced by natural glacial processes. The Antarctic pyramids are the same landform, in a region where the juxtaposition with the surrounding ice sheet makes the peaks look more dramatic and more isolated than the Matterhorn does in its more accessible alpine setting. What makes the story interesting beyond the factual correction is the psychology it illustrates. Human visual pattern recognition is specifically tuned to identify shapes associated with human construction, and the pyramidal form is so strongly associated with ancient human civilization that even trained viewers can have an initial response to a natural pyramid that triggers the artificial structure recognition system before the geological correction kicks in. The Antarctic pyramids fooled a lot of people, briefly, because human brains are built to notice pyramids. Story 12, the Antarctic Treaty banned militarization, or created a legal cover for hiding something. The Antarctic Treaty of 1959 is one of the Cold War era's more successful examples of international cooperation. 12 nations, including the United States and the Soviet Union at the height of Cold War tension, agreed to designate Antarctica as a zone of peaceful scientific research, to ban military installations and nuclear testing, and to allow free inspection of each other's facilities by any treaty party. It has held for over 6 decades, the continent has not been militarized, and the treaty is generally considered a genuine success of international law. The conspiracy reading of the treaty inverts this entirely. Under this interpretation, the specific provisions of the treaty, the restrictions on access, the banning of civilian settlement, the unusual secrecy that surrounds what research stations are actually discovering, are not evidence of successful international cooperation, but of successful international concealment. A group of nations that had every other reason to compete and spy on each other agreed, in remarkable unity, to keep Antarctica specifically off limits to public scrutiny. The question the conspiracy framing asks is, why would they agree so readily? Unless they all knew something that made agreement in their collective interest. The treaty does restrict civilian access in ways that have no real parallel for other parts of the Earth. Tourism is heavily regulated. Independent research is essentially impossible without nation-state sponsorship. What the research stations are actually finding beneath the ice is filtered entirely through their national governments before reaching the public. These are real features of Antarctic governance. Whether they reflect the pragmatic necessities of managing a harsh and remote continent, or whether they serve the additional function of controlling information about something specific, is the genuine uncertainty the treaty's provisions don't resolve. Story 13, John Kerry flew to Antarctica as Secretary of State. and the State Department was vague about why on November 11, 2016, 3 days after the U.S. presidential election, while the world's attention was almost entirely elsewhere, Secretary of State John Kerry flew to Antarctica. He was the most senior American government official ever to visit the continent, arriving at McMurdo Station and spending approximately a day observing conditions and meeting with researchers. The State Department's stated reason for the visit was climate change research and awareness. Kerry had been a prominent advocate for climate action throughout his time as Secretary of State, and visiting Antarctica to observe melting ice was contextually consistent with that advocacy. A retiring Secretary of State making a symbolic final tour of a climate-relevant location is not inherently suspicious. What the conspiracy theory community focused on was the specific timing, the week after a presidential election that would produce an administration broadly skeptical of climate science, which seemed like an odd moment for a climate symbolism trip, and the vagueness of the State Department's public communication about the visit's specific activities and meetings. Official spokespeople were not especially forthcoming about the detailed itinerary, who Kerry met with besides researchers, or whether any consultations occurred beyond the climate science framing. Kerry himself subsequently discussed the trip in interviews as a climate awareness effort and described being profoundly affected by observing the scale of Antarctic ice conditions. This is entirely consistent with the visit's stated purpose. What fueled the theory was the combination of unusual timing, unusual seniority for an Antarctic visit, and the characteristically vague official communications that accompany any government activity in a location with limited independent oversight. Story 14 Buzz Aldrin posted an ominous tweet before going to Antarctica, then was immediately evacuated in November 2016. Buzz Aldrin, the Apollo 11 astronaut who was the second human to walk on the moon, joined a group of tourists on an expedition to Antarctica organized through a private travel company. Aldrin was 86 at the time, and the trip to the South Pole was presented publicly as an adventure tour. He is known for continuing to pursue physically demanding experiences well into his later years. Before departing, Aldrin posted a photograph on social media showing an Antarctic landscape with the comment, "We are all in danger." It is evil itself. This message, combined with a separate post about the real story of Antarctica being about to emerge, generated significant online attention and speculation about what Aldrin had seen or was planning to reveal. Shortly after arriving in Antarctica, Aldrin became ill. The precise nature of the illness was described as fluid in his lungs and was medically evacuated to Christchurch, New Zealand for treatment, where he subsequently recovered fully. The evacuation happened quickly enough, and the original social media posts were unusual enough that the combination produced significant conspiracy, theorizing about whether he had been evacuated to prevent him from sharing whatever information his "We Are All in Danger" post hinted at. The most straightforward explanation is that an 86-year-old man traveling to the South Pole, one of the most demanding environments on Earth for cardiovascular health, developed a serious medical issue that required prompt evacuation, and that his pre-departure social media posts were atmospheric rather than literally meaningful. The post language is also consistent with the kind of drama an elderly astronaut celebrity might employ to generate engagement about an exciting adventure trip. What makes this persist as a theory is the specific combination of timing and content that is genuinely difficult to read as completely ordinary. Story 15 Large sections of Antarctic airspace are restricted, and the practical safety explanation doesn't satisfy everyone. Antarctic airspace restrictions are real, applying to significant portions of the continent and surrounding ocean, administered primarily through the specific practical challenges of aviation in one of the most hostile and remote environments on Earth. Extreme weather that develops rapidly, minimal navigation infrastructure compared to other parts of the world, very limited search and rescue capacity, and the specific hazards of operating aircraft in conditions where conventional radio communications are often impaired by atmospheric conditions. These explanations are genuine and operational. Aircraft that get into trouble over Antarctica are in a situation where help may be days or weeks away rather than hours, and the restrictions reflect a realistic assessment of what operations can be safely conducted in the region, rather than arbitrary exclusion. The conspiracy framing asks why certain specific areas appear consistently off limits beyond what the safety rationale alone would require, and whether the safety rationale is used to provide a conveniently practical-sounding reason for restrictions that actually serve information control purposes. A no-fly zone over a glacier is safe. A no-fly zone over a particular sector that also happens to be where anomalous gravity readings have been detected is safe plus something else potentially. The specific areas of Antarctic airspace that are restricted and the reasons cited for those specific restrictions are not always publicly detailed, which is itself part of the territory the conspiracy reading occupies. Antarctica is the one major landmass on Earth where a government can say aviation safety requires this airspace be restricted, and there is essentially no independent mechanism for challenging that justification through direct observation. Whether that creates a convenient cover for other purposes, or whether it simply reflects the genuine operational realities of a hostile remote continent, is the unresolvable question at the center of this entry. Story 16 multiple nations operate research stations whose activities are nearly impossible to independently verify. Antarctica currently hosts approximately 70 permanent and seasonal research stations operated by more than 30 countries, including the United States at McMurdo and South Pole stations, Russia at Vostok, China at several stations including Zhongshan and Kunlun, and various European and South American nations at installations scattered across the continent. What these stations are actually doing in their day-to-day operations is filtered through the national governments that operate them before reaching the public. Scientific research findings are published in peer-reviewed journals, which provides a form of independent verification for the science being done. But the totality of what research stations collect, observe, and do in the course of their operations is not independently verifiable by outside observers. Site visits by journalists or independent researchers require national government sponsorship. The Antarctic Treaty's inspection provisions allow other treaty parties to visit any facility, but those inspections are conducted by governments rather than the public or press. The Chinese expansion of Antarctic research presence has attracted specific attention. China has invested heavily in Antarctic infrastructure over the past 2 decades, building multiple stations, developing icebreaker capability, and establishing a presence that some observers have characterized as going beyond what pure scientific research requires. Whether this reflects legitimate scientific ambition, resource prospecting, or military reconnaissance is genuinely uncertain. Russia's Vostok station, which is drilled into the subglacial Lake Vostok, is among the stations conducting research whose findings have been most selectively released. The specific contents of the lake's water when first sampled, and what biological analysis of that water found, have been reported partially and with significant delays. Story 17 scientists found a massive gravitational anomaly under Antarctic ice the size of Ohio. The Wilkes Land gravity anomaly is a real, well-documented scientific discovery. A large-scale gravitational irregularity detected beneath the Antarctic ice sheet in the Wilkes Land region of East Antarctica, consistent in size and depth, with an enormous buried impact crater approximately 480 kilometers across. To put that in scale, the Chicxulub impactor, the asteroid impact that ended the Cretaceous period and drove the non-avian dinosaurs to extinction, produced a crater approximately 150 kilometers across. The Wilkes Land anomaly is consistent with an impact structure approximately 3 times the diameter of Chicxulub, which would make it the largest impact structure ever identified on Earth. The impactor responsible would have been an asteroid 4 times larger than the Chicxulub object. Geophysicists who have analyzed the gravity data estimate the impact likely occurred between 200 and 500 million years ago, if it did occur. The anomaly is consistent with an impact structure, but could also be consistent with other geological formations. And without drilling through 2.5 kilometers of ice to directly examine the underlying rock, the interpretation remains a best fit hypothesis rather than a confirmed finding. The timing, if the Wilkes Land impact is confirmed, would place it around the Permian-Triassic boundary, the period of the largest mass extinction in Earth's history, which killed approximately 90% of marine species and 70% of terrestrial vertebrate species. Whether a massive impact in Antarctica was connected to the Permian-Triassic extinction event or was simply coincident with it is unknown. This is a genuine scientific anomaly, scientifically interesting on its own terms, requiring no conspiracy additions. Something enormous is buried beneath the ice. Story 18: Russian scientists drilled into a lake sealed for 15 million years and found unknown life. Lake Vostok is a subglacial lake lying beneath approximately 7 kilometers of ice in East Antarctica, an enclosed body of liquid water that has been sealed from the atmosphere and the surface world by the ice sheet above it for an estimated 15 to 25 million years. It is one of the largest subglacial lakes on Earth, roughly the size of Lake Ontario, and maintaining liquid water at those depths requires geothermal heat from the rock beneath. Russian scientists at Vostok Station spent approximately 2 decades drilling through the overlying ice, one of the longest and most technically demanding drilling projects in scientific history, finally reaching the lake's water surface in February 2012. The moment of breakthrough, the drill penetrating the ice and lake water rising into the borehole under pressure, was a genuinely historic scientific moment. The first contact between the surface world and an environment that had been completely isolated for tens of millions of years. Subsequent analysis of ice samples from just above the lake's water surface and of water samples from the lake itself found microbial DNA sequences that could not be matched to any known species in genetic databases, sequences that were distinct enough that they couldn't be attributed to contamination from the drilling process with sufficient certainty. The findings were published in peer-reviewed journals and generated significant scientific discussion. The conspiracy theory layer focuses on the reporting gaps. The Russian team has been notably selective about what findings they release publicly and when, with significant delays between drilling milestones and published results. What was actually in the water when the drill first breached the lake, and what has been found in subsequent analysis, has not been fully disclosed in the public scientific literature. Story 19: Blood Falls runs red from a glacier and took scientists over a century to fully explain blood falls is exactly what its name implies. A blood-red outflow emerging from the Taylor Glacier in the McMurdo Dry Valleys of Antarctica, staining the ice and ground below it with a vivid red that looks, in photographs, genuinely alarming. The feature has been known to scientists since its discovery in 1911 by geologist Thomas Griffith Taylor, who initially and reasonably attributed the red color to red algae. The actual explanation took considerably longer to fully establish. What flows from blood falls is a hypersaline brine, salt water approximately 3 times saltier than the ocean, that is rich in iron, and that, when it contacts oxygen in the atmosphere, undergoes the same oxidation process that produces rust on iron. The red color is iron oxide, chemically identical to rust, formed as the ancient iron-rich brine is exposed to air for the first time after an estimated 1.5 to 2 million years of subglacial isolation. The source of the brine is a subglacial saltwater lake trapped below the glacier when the Taylor Valley was cut off from the sea approximately 1.5 to 2 million years ago. The lake has been gradually concentrating through evaporation and freeze out of water, while the iron content remains from the marine environment that originally filled the valley. A microbial ecosystem has been sustaining itself in this ancient, sealed, oxygen-free, iron-rich environment for those millions of years. Blood Falls is one of the best-studied examples of an extreme environment sustaining life, with direct implications for the search for life elsewhere in the solar system, specifically for Europa and Enceladus, moons with subsurface oceans that might create similar conditions. It does not need a conspiracy. The real science is genuinely strange enough. Story 20: The Bloop. A sound loud enough to be heard across thousands of miles, recorded near Antarctica in 1997. The NOAA's Autonomous Hydrophone Arrays, underwater microphone systems designed to monitor for submarine activity and natural ocean sounds, recorded an unusual ultra-low frequency sound near the southern end of South America. The sound, which NOAA analysts named the bloop, was detected on multiple hydrophones separated by distances of thousands of miles, meaning the source must have been extraordinarily powerful, loud enough that only extremely energetic sources could produce sound at that volume at low frequency. The bloop's frequency profile roughly matched the signature of a living animal, which immediately suggested the possibility of an enormous unknown deep-sea creature as its source, something considerably larger than any known marine animal. This is the version of the story that spread widely online and in popular science coverage. NOAA scientists who subsequently analyzed the recording attributed the bloop to icequake activity, the fracturing and movement of large Antarctic ice masses, which can produce sounds of the relevant frequency and amplitude. The 2012 explanation pointed specifically to the acoustic signature of the sound being consistent with large ice events rather than biological sources. The icequake explanation is scientifically credible and accepted in the relevant professional community. The conspiracy and creature theory community has maintained that the explanation was too conveniently timed, and that specific characteristics of the recording are more consistent with a biological source than NOAA acknowledged. Whether you find the icequake explanation satisfying depends substantially on your prior beliefs about Antarctic scientific transparency, which is the specific position this story occupies in the broader Antarctica conspiracy ecology. Even its mundane explanation references the ice, which is where everything else is being hidden. Story 21 Antarctica was once a forest, and some take this much further than the geology warrants fossilized plant material from Antarctica, including tree trunks, leaves, and other organic remains preserved for approximately 280 million years in the Transantarctic Mountains, is a well-documented scientific fact, confirming that Antarctica was once a temperate continent with forests rather than an ice-covered polar landmass. The planet has been both warmer and cooler than its current state throughout geological history, and Antarctica's polar position hasn't always meant an Antarctic ice sheet. This is genuinely fascinating paleontology, studied extensively, and published in peer-reviewed literature. The ancient forest material in Antarctica tells us something important about continental drift, ancient climate conditions, and the deep history of the southern hemisphere. The conspiracy layer that attaches to this genuine scientific finding is the claim that a more recent past, much more recent than 280 million years ago, saw a warm, inhabited Antarctica. The theory proposes that the continent was ice-free within human history, that an advanced civilization lived there before some catastrophe covered it in ice within a geologically very recent period, and that evidence of this civilization is concealed beneath the ice that covers the continent today. The geological record doesn't support this. Antarctica has been glaciated for approximately 34 million years. The ice sheet that covers it today formed gradually over millions of years, not suddenly in any period remotely connected to human history. The ancient forests are 280 million years old, not thousands of years old. The geology is very clear on these timescales. The conspiracy reading requires either that the geology is wrong or that an extremely sophisticated cover-up of geological evidence is ongoing. It persists because the correct fact, Antarctica once had forests, is striking enough that people hearing it for the first time sometimes don't absorb the timescales involved. Story 22, the Google Earth Pyramid, a triangular mountain that went viral and then got explained away in 2016. Satellite imagery showing a sharply triangular, almost perfectly pyramidal peak in the heritage range of Antarctica circulated widely online with the claim that it was evidence of an ancient, advanced civilization. Specifically, that the feature was a man-made pyramid constructed at a time when Antarctica was ice-free and inhabited. The feature is real and visually striking, a four-sided peak with steep, relatively symmetric faces that produces a pyramid-like profile in aerial imagery. The satellite images that circulated were genuine NOAA and Google Earth captures of actual terrain. The geological explanation is the same as the Pyramid Mountains covered elsewhere in this collection. The feature is a horn peak, produced by the same freeze-thaw weathering and glacial erosion that shapes similar peaks in the Alps, Himalayas, and other glaciated mountain ranges. The Matterhorn is a horn peak. The Antarctic Pyramid is a horn peak. The process that creates them doesn't require human construction. It requires rock that is harder than the surrounding material, exposure to ice on multiple faces, and sufficient time for differential erosion to carve the characteristic angular shape. What made this specific example more viral than the other Nunataks featured elsewhere in this collection was the combination of particularly symmetric shape, clear satellite imagery, and timing that coincided with an active period of Antarctic conspiracy theory interest. The feature has a name. Mount Vinson in the Heritage Range is nearby, though the specific peak is typically referred to by its coordinates in the viral content rather than by any established name, and has been visited and photographed by mountaineers without any findings inconsistent with an ordinary rocky peak. Story 23 Antarctica has preserved meteorites for millions of years, including one from Mars that NASA thought showed life. Antarctica is the best place on Earth to find meteorites. The combination of ice sheet movement and ablation zones, areas where ice evaporates without melting, concentrates meteorites that have fallen across the continent over millions of years into specific collection areas, where they sit preserved on the surface of the ice in conditions that prevent the weathering and contamination that destroys meteorite samples in most other environments. Approximately 45,000 meteorites have been collected from Antarctica, representing a disproportionate fraction of all meteorites in museum collections worldwide. Among the Antarctic meteorites is ALH 84001, a rock approximately 4.5 billion years old that originated on Mars, ejected from the Martian surface by an impact billions of years ago, eventually captured by Earth's gravity, and preserved in Antarctic ice for approximately 13,000 years before collection in 1984. In 1996, a team of NASA scientists published a paper in Science arguing that ALH 84001 contained possible evidence of past Martian microbial life, specific chemical compounds, structural features, and microscopic forms that they argued were consistent with biological processes rather than purely geological ones. The 1996 announcement was genuine, high profile, and announced at a White House press conference attended by President Clinton. The subsequent scientific debate has been extensive and has mostly, though not conclusively, moved against the biological interpretation. The specific features cited in the original paper have been reproduced by non-biological processes in laboratory conditions, and the scientific consensus leans toward abiotic explanations. The paper has never been retracted. The authors have continued to defend aspects of their interpretation. The question of whether the first evidence of extraterrestrial life was found in an Antarctic meteorite, quietly buried in scientific controversy, is not fully closed. Story 24 Flat Earth believers think Antarctica is an ice wall around the edge of the world. The Flat Earth model, in its contemporary iteration as promoted by various online communities and a small number of high-profile advocates, requires some explanation for Antarctica, a continent that in the standard spherical Earth model is at the South Pole and provides the boundary case for how far south can you go. The Flat Earth solution is elegant in its own terms. Antarctica isn't a continent, but a ring. Under the Flat Earth model, the Earth is a disk with the Arctic at the center, the known continents spread across its surface, and a massive wall of ice, Antarctic ice, forming the outer rim of the disk, beyond which is either the void of space or unknown territory depending on the specific Flat Earth theory version. The ice wall is maintained to prevent people from reaching the edge and discovering the reality of the world's shape. The relevant question isn't why Flat Earth believers hold this view, it's required by their model, but why Antarctica specifically generates more conspiracy theories than any other geographic region, and why the ice wall theory attaches so cleanly to the same institutional secrecy features that more conventional Antarctic theories focus on. The Antarctic Treaty's access restrictions, the no-fly zones, the government-controlled research stations, all of the features that feed mainstream Antarctic conspiracy theories are equally useful to flat Earth theorizing, because they're real features of how Antarctica is governed. The ice wall theory is testable and has been tested. Numerous independent maritime and aerial expeditions have circumnavigated Antarctica. Multiple countries have stations positioned around the continent, and satellite mapping confirms its topology. It requires a global conspiracy of almost impossible scope to maintain, but its persistence illustrates that the same real features of Antarctic access control that feed credible conspiracy theories also provide material for ones that are much harder to defend. Story 25. The Denver airport's underground tunnels are supposedly connected to a hidden Antarctic base, Denver International Airport, opened in 1995, over budget and significantly delayed, and has been a consistent source of conspiracy theorizing ever since, primarily driven by its unusual and genuinely unsettling public art, which includes enormous murals depicting dead and burning cities. A large blue horse with glowing red eyes that killed its creator during installation, gargoyles that appear to emerge from suitcases, and dedication plaques inscribed with Masonic symbols. The airport also has an extensive automated baggage system with underground tunnels that were well documented during the troubled construction period, and whose existence, combined with the rest of the airport's unusual character, has made it a standard fixture in conspiracy theories about hidden infrastructure. The specific claim connecting Denver to Antarctica, that a secret tunnel or transportation network links the airport's underground infrastructure to a hidden Antarctic installation, part of a broader elite survival and power network, is one of the more geographically challenged conspiracy claims in an already crowded field. Denver to Antarctica is approximately 13,000 kilometers. The engineering required for a tunnel of that length would exceed the total tunnel construction in human history by several orders of magnitude. The theory persists not because anyone seriously believes a tunnel exists, but because Denver Airport, with its documented unusual features, and Antarctica, with its documented access restriction, both occupy spaces in the conspiracy ecology as places where something is being hidden. Linking them requires only connecting two hidden nodes, regardless of whether the connection has any physical basis. The airport has responded to its conspiracy theory status with characteristic wit, installing gargoyle statues in the terminal that hold conspiracy theory plaques, and running marketing campaigns that lean into the what's really in those tunnels framing. Sometimes the best response to conspiracy is to market it. Story 26. CERN and Antarctic research stations are supposedly secretly building a portal together. CERN, the European Organization for Nuclear Research, operates the Large Hadron Collider at its facility on the French-Swiss border and is the subject of persistent conspiracy theories involving dimensional portals, dark matter experiments gone wrong, summoning of entities through high-energy physics, and various other claims that treat the specific activities of the world's most prominent particle physics laboratory as cover for something considerably more dramatic. The Antarctic connection in this theory comes from the combination of CERN's actual research trips and experiments at various locations, including some Antarctic facilities where cosmic ray research and other experiments have been conducted, and the general tendency for conspiracy theories to connect two sources of institutional secrecy, CERN and Antarctica, on the grounds that both involve things the public can't directly verify. The specific claim that CERN scientists and Antarctic station personnel are secretly collaborating to open an interdimensional portal using particle physics at one end and some complementary technology in Antarctic ice at the other is assembled from actual elements that don't combine the way the theory requires. CERN does physics experiments. Some of those experiments involve detecting particles that originate in space and arrive at the Earth's poles. The Ice Cube Neutrino Observatory, buried in Antarctic ice, detects neutrinos using exactly this method. Neutrinos from CERN have been aimed at detectors. None of this constitutes portal building. The theory requires taking genuine physics experiments, neutrino generation, cosmic ray detection, high-energy particle collisions, and treating their technical opacity as cover for a purpose the physics doesn't support. The technology isn't a portal. It's a detector array and a particle accelerator used for the purposes they're publicly described as serving. Story 27, a niche claim, says some Apollo footage was actually filmed in Antarctica. Not the moon landing conspiracy theory ecosystem is large, varied, and contains a specific niche that focuses on where allegedly staged footage might have been produced. The standard version of the faked moon landing theory proposes that Stanley Kubrick filmed the lunar footage in a specially constructed studio, drawing on the technical and cinematic innovations he had demonstrated in 2001. A Space Odyssey. The Antarctic variant is less commonly cited, but exists in the specific corner of conspiracy theory that focuses on the visual similarities between Antarctic terrain, stark, white, relatively flat expanses lit by oblique sunlight that creates strong shadows, and certain portions of lunar surface footage. The argument is that some scenes, particularly exterior footage with specific lighting and landscape characteristics, could have been filmed in Antarctica's unique photographic conditions rather than in a soundstage. The visual similarity argument is genuine. Antarctic terrain under certain lighting conditions does produce imagery that shares aesthetic characteristics with lunar surface photography. Both environments are predominantly white. Both involve extremely bright direct sunlight with minimal atmospheric diffusion, and both create high-contrast shadow patterns that differ from normal terrestrial daylight photography. The argument is not compelling, however, because the similarities are adequately explained by the physics of extreme environments rather than by location substitution. The Apollo footage, when examined for what it actually shows, specific geological features, specific equipment in specific configurations, specific lighting angles that match the documented lunar environment at specific times, is consistent with the moon and inconsistent with Antarctica in numerous specific ways that go beyond the general visual similarity. The argument requires treating superficial visual similarity as evidence while ignoring the specific details that distinguish the locations. Story 28, Canadian military sonar detected a mysterious repeating ping from the Arctic seafloor in the autumn of 2016. Hunters and Inuit community members in the Nunavut territory of Canada's Arctic began reporting an unusual pinging or beeping sound that appeared to emanate from the seafloor of a section of Hecla and Fury Strait, a narrow passage connecting Fox Basin and Hudson Bay that is an important traditional hunting ground for marine mammals, including seals and walruses. The sound was described as occurring regularly, audible from the surface and through the hulls of boats, and the community observed that the marine mammal populations in the area had been absent during a season when they would normally be present. The Canadian Department of National Defence dispatched a military patrol aircraft to survey the area and investigate the reported anomaly. The Canadian military's official investigation found no explanation for the reported sound. The survey flight, while confirming the area was devoid of the marine mammals that normally frequent it, did not identify any vessel, equipment, installation, or natural phenomenon that accounted for the pinging. The official statement was essentially, "We looked, we found nothing, we don't know what it was." The conspiracy theory linking the Arctic ping to Antarctic phenomena is the weakest of the connections in this collection, drawing primarily on the coincidence that 2016 was an active year for Antarctic conspiracy theory development, and that unexplained sounds in polar waters are a natural fit for the same narrative ecology. The two events, Arctic ping, Antarctic anomalies, have no documented connection, and the Arctic ping's own explanation remains officially unresolved. What the Arctic ping story illustrates is how genuine, officially unresolved anomalies in remote and minimally monitored locations become absorbed into existing conspiracy frameworks regardless of whether the events are related. Story 29, the Endurance wreck was found in perfect condition after 107 years, and some found that suspicious the Endurance Ernest Shackleton's ship that was crushed by Antarctic pack ice and sank in November 1915 during his ill-fated Imperial Trans-Antarctic expedition, was finally located in March 2022 by the Endurance 22 expedition, lying at 3,008 meters depth in the Weddell Sea. The discovery was genuine and well documented, producing underwater footage from remotely operated vehicles that showed the ship's hull, deck, masts, and details, including the ship's wheel and the name Endurance on the stern, in what experts described as remarkable preservation. The ship's condition was genuinely exceptional. At that depth, in water below 2 degrees Celsius, with no light and minimal biological activity to accelerate degradation, the Endurance had been preserved in a way that superficially intact ships at shallower, warmer depths are not. Wood-boring organisms that rapidly destroy wooden shipwrecks in warmer waters are largely absent in the Weddell Sea's deep cold. The result was a wreck that looked almost as though it had sunk recently, rather than a century ago. The conspiracy framing that attached to this, the suggestion that the wreck's too perfect preservation indicated unnatural preservation, possibly by forces protecting the site for purposes connected to other Antarctic conspiracies, misunderstands the basic oceanography. Deep Antarctic waters are cold, dark, and biologically minimalist in specific ways that are well understood to preserve organic material. The Mary Rose, raised from the Solent after 437 years, was in comparable preservation due to similar anaerobic conditions, and no one proposed supernatural protection for that wreck. What the Endurance's discovery actually demonstrates is that the deep Southern Ocean is a remarkable natural preservation environment, and that ships can survive for over a century in these conditions in ways they wouldn't at other depths and temperatures. Story 30 Britain's Antarctic station had to be relocated after a crack appeared, and some think they were hiding something. The crack revealed Halley the 6 is the United Kingdom's Antarctic research station, operated by the British Antarctic Survey on the Brunt Ice Shelf. It is an engineering achievement in its own right, a modular station built on ski-fitted legs that allow it to be relocated by tractor, designed specifically for a situation where ice shelf movement might require the station to move. In 2016-17, the station was indeed relocated approximately 23 kilometers from its original position after monitoring detected a large crack in the ice shelf that put the original site at risk of calving into the sea. The relocation was entirely consistent with the station's design purpose. Halley the 6 was specifically built to be movable precisely because the Brunt Ice Shelf is dynamically active and calving events are predictable over long timescales. The crack's development was monitored, the relocation decision was made on scientific grounds, and the move was accomplished over multiple seasons. This is the station working exactly as designed. The conspiracy theory attaches to the specific timing and the physical process of what a calving ice event exposes. If a section of ice shelf breaks away, the seabed beneath it and the ice at the newly exposed face are available for observation in ways they were not before. The framing that the British Antarctic Survey moved specifically to conceal whatever the crack was revealing requires that the crack expose something that the station's operators were motivated to hide, and that the relocation was cover rather than safety management. The alternative explanation is a government research station doing exactly what it was designed to do in a predictable ice environment. Story 31, the 72-hour Antarctic blackout that left no official record. This entry is one of the more purely apocryphal stories in the Antarctica conspiracy collection. A rumor that circulates in online communities describing a supposed continental-scale communications blackout lasting approximately 72 hours, during which all communications from Antarctic research stations were simultaneously blocked or went offline, with no explanation ever provided and no official record of the event. The claim faces a specific evidentiary problem. The absence of official records is itself the evidence being cited. For an event that allegedly affected communications across an entire continent simultaneously, involving dozens of research stations operated by multiple sovereign nations with their own independent communications infrastructure, there should be some record somewhere. internal station logs, anomaly reports to national Antarctic programs, communications to ship traffic in the region if the event occurred at scale. No such records have been produced. The origin of the 72-hour blackout story appears to trace to online forum discussions rather than any documented incident, and the specific details, the duration, the scope, the claimed secrecy, vary between tellings in ways consistent with a story that is being embellished through repetition rather than accurately reported from a consistent source. This doesn't mean it's impossible that a localized communications disruption affected some Antarctic facilities at some point for technical reasons. Satellite communications in polar regions can be unreliable, and equipment failures are common in extreme cold. What it means is that the specific claim, coordinated continental-scale blackout, 72 hours, no official record, has the structure of a rumor rather than a documented event. In an ecosystem where genuine Antarctic anomalies are plentiful, the 72-hour blackout is the entry most reliant on the absence of evidence as its own supporting argument. Story 32, the Vela incident, has an Antarctic offshoot theory that researchers there were involved in a secret nuclear test. The Vela incident of September 22, 1979, is covered elsewhere in this collection as a standalone mystery. A satellite detected double flash over the South Atlantic that has never been officially attributed, with the most credible theory pointing to a joint Israeli-South African nuclear test. The incident itself is genuinely unresolved in official terms. The Antarctic extension of the Vela theory is an offshoot that places some element of the test's organization, monitoring, or execution at Antarctic research stations. The geographic logic is not absurd. The detected flash was near Prince Edward Island, roughly 2,000 kilometers from the Antarctic coast, and any clandestine testing in those waters would have been far from normal shipping lanes and population centers, but within range of Antarctic station monitoring equipment. The South African and Israeli nuclear programs both had international networks of scientists and supporting infrastructure, and the specific monitoring requirements for a clandestine nuclear test, equipment to verify the test worked, to measure yield, to assess fallout, would benefit from remote, isolated positioning that Antarctic facilities could theoretically provide. Whether any Antarctic research station had any role in monitoring or supporting the 1979 test, if it was a test, is speculation without documentary support. The Vela incident's core mystery is real enough to sustain speculation without requiring Antarctic involvement, and the Antarctic extension adds geographic distance without adding evidential weight. The connection is worth noting as an example of how two genuine mysteries, the Vela incident and Antarctic access restrictions, attract linking theories because both involve real institutional secrecy without achieving a level of documentation that would close either question. Story 33, the Russian Lake Vostok drilling team reportedly picked up an anomalous electromagnetic signal, then went silent among the fringe reports circulating in online communities about the Lake Vostok drilling project, is the claim that the Russian team, at the moment their drill first breached the lake's water surface in February 2012, detected an anomalous electromagnetic signal emanating from within the lake, a signal inconsistent with any natural geological or biological phenomenon, suggesting artificial origin, before communications from the team went quiet for an unusual period. This claim does not appear in any verified scientific publication, any Russian government statement about the Vostok drilling program, or any source journalism from Antarctic science correspondents who covered the drilling breakthrough. It originates in online discussion forums and appears to have been generated as elaboration on two real facts: that the Russian team did experience a communications blackout of some days following the drilling breakthrough, and that what they found in the lake has been published selectively and with significant delay. The actual communications interruption following the breakthrough was reported by sources including the U.S. Antarctic Program and was apparently related to the practical challenges of communication during the intense operations of the breakthrough period rather than to any anomalous discovery. The Russian team's selective publication of results is documented and has been criticized by the international scientific community, but the pattern is more consistent with scientific competition and institutional protection of research priority than with covering up electromagnetic anomalies. The story illustrates how real mysteries, what's in Lake Vostok, why Russian publication has been slow, what happened during the communication gap, provide material for elaboration that goes considerably beyond what the available evidence supports. Story 34: Ghost Ship Reports from Antarctic Waters. Vessels that appear on radar and never materialize. Maritime folklore about phantom ships. Vessels that appear on radar or are visually sighted cannot be raised on communications and disappear before any contact can be made. Has a long history in shipping across all oceans. The specific Antarctic and Southern Ocean variants of this folklore are shaped by the particular characteristics of that region's maritime environment: extraordinary atmospheric conditions, extreme weather, limited traffic that makes any anomalous detection more notable, and the general mystery that attaches to anything occurring in the world's most remote ocean. Radar contacts in polar waters can be genuinely deceptive due to atmospheric effects. Temperature inversions create ducting conditions where radar beams bend around the Earth's surface, allowing contacts to appear at ranges far beyond normal radar coverage, sometimes hundreds of miles, before fading as the atmospheric conditions change. A contact that appears on radar holds a position and then disappears without any corresponding visual sighting or radio response could reflect something real, but atmospherically distorted rather than a ghost ship. The specific Southern Ocean conditions, cold, dense air under warmer air masses from the tropics, create more frequent ducting conditions than most ocean regions, meaning radar anomalies are a genuine operational consideration for ships in Antarctic waters, rather than a purely folkloric addition. Whether any of the specific ghost ship reports from Antarctic maritime crews reflect vessels associated with classified operations, submarines, resupply missions to facilities that don't appear on public records, rather than atmospheric radar anomalies, is impossible to determine from outside the operational records of the nations operating in those waters. The ghost ship tradition provides a narrative container for both genuine atmospheric phenomena and the possibility of traffic that isn't supposed to be visible. Story 35: The Second Sun Photographs from Antarctica. Ice crystals or hidden celestial object? Photographs taken by researchers and visitors at Antarctic stations occasionally show what appears to be a second bright disk near the sun, a separate circular bright spot in the sky that, in some images, looks distinct enough to be mistaken for a second sun. These photographs are real, have been shared by researchers at various Antarctic stations over the years, and are striking enough to produce a reliable cycle of viral sharing, with captions about a second sun or hidden celestial objects, visible only from the poles. The atmospheric optical phenomenon responsible is well documented and understood. Sundogs, technically called parhelia, are bright spots that appear on one or both sides of the sun at an angular distance of approximately 22 degrees, produced by the refraction of sunlight through plate-shaped ice crystals suspended in the atmosphere at specific orientations. When conditions are right, the right crystal size, shape, and alignment in the atmosphere, parhelia can be bright enough and circular enough that they genuinely look like separate suns in photographs, particularly at the oblique sun angles that occur near the poles. Antarctica's atmosphere is particularly conducive to parhelia because it contains high concentrations of atmospheric ice crystals at various altitudes throughout much of the year, and the low sun angles that persist across Antarctic seasons create the geometric conditions for the effect more consistently than at other latitudes. Researchers at Antarctic stations see parhelia frequently enough that it's considered a normal feature of the visual environment, rather than a remarkable event. The conspiracy reading substitutes hidden celestial object only visible from the poles for a refraction effect that is visible anywhere cold enough with the right ice crystal conditions, and whose polar frequency reflects the prevalence of those conditions rather than any special access to hidden cosmology.